Ivan Belov, nicknamed Raven behind his back, had been walking for almost 2 hours with his dog, exhausted from fatigue, sinking into the wet autumn moss. The sun, exhausted by mid-October, barely broke through the heavy canopy of fir trees. A huge black-as-night shadow, a male dog, not just a husky, but more like a wolf that had been tamed, dragged itself along ahead, its low, muffled breathing the only sound breaking the silence of the dying taiga. They were returning from an 8-day raid. Their prey, 2 powerful moose and 3 martens, tied to homemade sleds, which Ivan and Shadow took turns pulling out of the forest thicket. Raven felt the leaden weight of fatigue flooding his muscles, but his mind remained as sharp as his knife. He always walked like this, on the verge of physical exhaustion, to clear his mind of everything superfluous and superficial. At that moment, there was no money, no time, no memories of the life he had led when he still wore epaulets. There was only one goal: to return to the warmth and silence of his home, almost invisible in this world. They came out onto a broken, barely visible road leading to a former lumberjack settlement, which now depended on the good word of a few old men and Ivan himself. It was here, on the border between civilization and the wild, that Raven felt truly alive. He took off his backpack, wiped his wet face with the sleeve of his old, faded jacket, and took out a flask of hot, strong tea. The shadow, collapsed in the red grass, only sighed heavily. At that moment, a strange sound emerged from around the bend. The indistinct hum of a running engine, disturbing the harmony of the taiga. Soon a bright blue government SUV jumped out of the fog, braking sharply and showering Ivan and Shadow with a cloud of dust and exhaust fumes. At the wheel sat Captain Fomin, a young man of 30, whose face had not yet been hardened by power, but had already lost all trace of youthful naivety. He was dressed in a freshly ironed uniform, and his excessive neatness amid the forest mud always annoyed Ivan. Artem Sergeyevich. Fomin's voice was sharp and arrogant. He did not even deign to address Ivan by his patronymic. Fomin got out of the car, adjusted his belt, and looked Ivan, his sled, and his dog over with a contemptuous glance, barely hiding the disgust with which he always looked at the local taiga inhabitants. Fomin couldn't understand how a former investigator, a man with 2 higher educations, could trade a comfortable city life and career for this wilderness, for a life full of dirt and risk. It didn't fit into his frame of reference. "I'm not Artem Sergeyevich, I'm Ivan," Voron said coldly, putting down the flask without changing his posture or even moving from his spot. He could sense the captain's foolish, city-dweller arrogance, and it repelled him more than the smell of gasoline. "It doesn't matter," Fomin waved him off, ignoring Ivan's icy tone. "I have orders from my superiors to find you, urgently." "I could have done it myself, don't doubt it. But this case, it's not ours. It's not a drunken argument over a samovar." Ivan slowly got up, feeling his muscles protest. "Speak, Fomin. Time is money, and I don't like it when you disturb my peace." "And I really like my peace." The captain glanced nervously at the forest, as if afraid that the wild trees might hear him. "Yesterday, at the winter camp on Malaya Kurumka, you know the place, 12 kilometers from here, they found 3 people, illegal miners, killed brutally. We sent experts there, but they can't work there. They need clear-cut fights, And here it's just a nightmare. Ivan felt something change in his inner, purified world. Prospectors? The ones who brought the new noisy motor pumps here? I asked them to leave, warned them. The TAIGA does not tolerate greed. How were they killed? The investigator from the city, his name is Prokhorov, has already declared it a case of internal conflict. Money, he says, wasn't divided, you know. He says they were chopped up with something heavy. Maybe a sledgehammer or something like that. And that they provoked each other. But Fomin paused, and a genuine, unfeigned concern finally flashed in his eyes. That was enough for Voron. But there's blood, Ivan. A lot of blood. And no logic. It looks like a massacre, yes, but not a drunken brawl. It's some kind of purge. They were all lying there as if they had been lined up, and there was almost no money there, even though they had been working for 3 weeks. Prokhorov is closing the case as a domestic dispute so as not to cause a fuss. But I know he's wrong. I need your help. You're the only one who knows how things work around here. Fomin didn't ask, he demanded. But there was a note of desperation in his demand that made Ivan reconsider his refusal. He despised this police routine, their ability to tailor reality to the appropriate article of the code. But the word purge and the mention of no logic caught his attention. Voron knew perfectly well that in the TAIGA there was only one logic: survival. And the murder of 3 people with so much blood and with such professional skill, that was no longer just survival. It was a message. I'm not an investigator, Fomin. I'm a hunter. Voron stroked Shadow's powerful broad head. The dog, sensing his tension, immediately stood up, ready to move. My methods won't fit into Prokhorov's protocol. I don't need his paperwork. I'll work on my own. If you find something that can't be covered up as everyday life, I'll help you. If not, consider that I promised you nothing. The captain didn't seem to breathe while Voron was speaking. I agree. I need the truth, Ivan. Not a report. I know you see things others don't. Ivan nodded. He didn't bother explaining to Fomin that for him, this story was no longer about prospectors or gold. It was about a balance that had been disrupted, about blood that had been spilled on the ground, demanding an answer. It was an insult to the TAIGA, and such an insult could not be forgiven. The inner voice that Voron always obeyed unquestioningly was already whispering. This was not a conflict. It was punishment. Take the sled. Put the moose in your clean trunk, Voron commanded, already turning around. He didn't even bother to change his clothes. He knew that the faster he got there, the fewer false traces the city bustle would leave behind. What about Shadow? Fomin asked, looking apprehensively at the black dog. Shadow is part of me. He'll see what your experts won't, replied Raven. He sat down in the passenger seat, his hands in his pockets. And while Fomin, wrinkling his nose at the smell of game and wet dog, drove them to the scene of the crime, Ivan looked at the forest flying by. He felt the TAIGA silence fill with nervous, predatory anticipation. He knew that this case would not be like the ones he had handled before. The engine roared, kicking up muddy spray. The oblivion he had found on his 8-day hike was shattered. Now, someone else's blood and lies awaited him. Raven closed his eyes, trying to tune his inner ear
to what the winter hut, its walls, its stones would tell him. His only thought was, the investigator declared the case closed, but that night I dreamed of a silent witness. And this was not just a beautiful expression. It was his deep, almost mystical conviction. He felt that someone or something in this wilderness had witnessed the murder and was now waiting for him. Voron spent the remaining half of the journey to the Malaya Karumka winter hut in painful, absolute silence, which seemed to weigh even on Fomin's old, creaky SUV. The captain tried to say something about protocols, about how to properly report his assistants to his superiors, but Voron did not listen. He just stared at the trees slowly passing by, which were getting darker and denser the closer they got to the scene of the tragedy. The taiga, always speaking in thousands of invisible sounds, was now deathly quiet. It was the silence that comes before a storm or after a gunshot, when nature holds its breath to assess the damage done to it. Voron could already feel this false, imposed silence, as if an invisible dome had covered the place. Finally, the car stopped on a barely noticeable clearing that led to the winter hut itself. People in uniform were already bustling around. 2 forensic experts, investigator Prokhorov, and several local employees, clearly bored and shifting from foot to foot. Despite the presence of so many people, the atmosphere was not businesslike. It was somehow crumpled, unfinished, as if Prokhorov himself, a large man with a tired, puffy face, had already made a decision and was just waiting for his people to finish the formalities. Voron jumped to the ground, and Shadow, who was immediately beside him, bared his teeth at the strangers. Yvonne just pressed his palm lightly on the dog's neck, and the dog, realizing that these weren't his enemies, at least for now, calmed down. But his fur was still standing on end. The first thing Raven read about the victims was their attitude toward the place they had come to rob. Just a couple of dozen steps from the winter hut, right in the middle of the moss, lay mountains of household waste. Tin cans and plastic bottles, which do not decompose in the taiga for decades. Next to this domestic stain, he noticed stumps, fresh, roughly chopped. Not only dead wood, but also young, strong fir trees that had been used for bonfires and flooring. They lived here like barbarians, not as guests, but as invaders, who take everything they need without giving anything in return. They brought with them greed, which, according to Voron, was the most destructive virus in the world. And that alone spoke volumes. The taiga does not tolerate such things. Prokhorov, seeing how Fomin had brought this strange local to the scene, frowned, but approached to pay his respects to the formalities. Captain Fomin, I told you, the case is closed. An internal quarrel, domestic stuff. And I don't have time for your experiments with former employees. Here, take a look. Prokhorov handed Fomin a crumpled sheet of paper. Inside, signs of a struggle, drinking, the murder weapon, a sledgehammer, was lying there. The gold was probably hidden, or someone managed to run away with it. The usual story, Captain. Let's get this off the agenda quickly, so we don't embarrass ourselves in front of the whole district. Voron didn't listen to his explanations. He did what the official investigators hadn't done. He walked around the winter hut in a wide circle, not approaching the bloodstain, but reading the perimeter. The winter hut was a primitive, low-log cabin, but its front door was ajar. When Ivan got closer, he felt a wave of cold and the disgusting, metallic smell of blood hit his face. The shadow whimpered in a low, guttural sound, not out of fear, but out of deep anxiety. Voron entered. Inside, there was controlled chaos. Everything pointed to a fight. An overturned table, a knocked-over kerosene lamp, a torn sleeping bag. But Raven, who had seen hundreds of domestic murders, knew what a real, animalistic fight for life looked like. There was always frenzied blind rage, sloppiness, attempts to grab something to fight back with. A pot, a log, a rock. Here, everything looked too staged. The bodies, mutilated by blows from something heavy, lay unnaturally, as if they had been placed there after death. And the sledgehammer, declared the murder weapon, looked too clean for such a large-scale, bloody act. The sledgehammer was lying there, not thrown down in haste. It was a sham, a crude but unfortunately effective performance for the city police. A setup, Voron whispered, his voice sounding like the rustle of dry leaves. This was not a drunken brawl. It was a cold-blooded, professional hit, carried out by a man who feared neither blood nor the law, nor, most importantly, the TAIGA. The killer didn't panic. He had everything calculated. The items were scattered to imitate an internal conflict. But the murder itself was too precise. Powerful, targeted blows, delivered with knowledge of anatomy, to deprive the victim of the ability to resist. Not a single unnecessary movement. Even felt his obsession with the truth, which he had tried to bury in this wilderness, rearing its head. He went outside again, ignoring Prokhorov's disapproving look. He had to find what the killer had failed to hide, because he himself considered it insignificant. His gaze fell on a small, perfectly smooth, dark stone, similar to volcanic basalt, which lay a few meters from the entrance, half buried in moss. It was not on the path, but slightly to the side, where a person stops to catch their breath after hard work. The raven crouched down, and Shadow immediately put his muzzle on his shoulder. The stone was cold and damp. Ivan carefully wiped it clean of moss and dirt, and under a layer of taiga dust, he saw it. A single, carelessly but clearly scratched mark. It wasn't even a symbol, but some kind of indistinct mark, similar to an upside-down Latin letter Z, but with an additional short stroke at the bottom. The mark had been made with a thin, very sharp object, without haste, with confidence. It wasn't graffiti. It wasn't an accident. It was a seal. The killer wasn't hiding. He was leaving a warning, or perhaps a signature. He wanted to be understood, but not by those who would arrive with their papers and protocols, but by those who read the TAIGA. Raven understood. This stone was not a weapon. It was a message, intended only for him. He looked up at the forest. The greed of the prospectors, their disregard for the TAIGA, all this was part of his method. The killer would not have wasted his energy staging a fight if his goal had been only money. He could have simply killed and left, taking the gold with him. No, this massacre was punishment. The TAIGA itself had sentenced these people for their carelessness and greed, for cutting down young trees, for tons of garbage, for spoiled land, and the killer was just its cold-blooded executor. Raven stood up, clutching the stone tightly. He could feel the cold of the basalt penetrating his thick skin, and, more importantly, the cold, calculating will of the killer. "Shadow," he said quietly, his voice firm. They're not waiting for us here. We need to go where he went, away from here. He glanced at the thick, steep slope that no fugitive carrying a trophy would dare to climb. He knew that the official investigation, represented by Prokhorov, was already dead, buried under a pile of useless papers and false evidence. Now his hunt, Vorona's hunt, was beginning. A hunt for the one who had decided he had the right to be the judge in this forest. He did not return to Fomin, did not show him the stone. His gaze was fixed upward at the dull, low sky. This gesture expressed his disbelief in city law and his obsession with the truth. He simply began to climb the slope that no one had bothered to check. The killer did not run away. He left, and that changed everything. Ivan did not wait for the reaction of the stunned Fomin or the protests of Prokhorov, who was still standing with a crumpled report in his hands. He simply stepped to the foot of the steep slope, overgrown with deadwood and large rocks. The shadow, as if reading his unspoken command, easily bypassed the low-growing shrubs and began to sniff around, sniffing the ground. This slope was the worst choice for an escape. It was so steep that climbing it without special equipment, or at least an axe to cut down supports, was extremely difficult, and descending it was almost impossible, especially if the criminal was carrying a heavy load, be it gold or a murder weapon. Fugitives always choose a path, always go downhill, toward water or a road. And this is especially true for someone who has committed such a bloody crime. Climbing this slope was illogical for a fugitive. It was the route of a master who simply decided to shorten his journey without fear of pursuit. It was a challenge. The raven ignored the voices coming from the winter hut. He focused on what the ground was showing him. On the rocks, covered with 10 years of moss, there were barely noticeable traces. Not footprints, but rather flattened, trampled moss. The mark of a very precise and powerful push. The criminal did not slip or slide. He moved with astonishing, almost superhuman confidence. His physical training must have been exceptional, or he was incredibly familiar with every rock and ledge on this seemingly insurmountable climb. The raven, himself a master of the taiga, immediately recognized this skill. No city gangster, even the strongest, could have made such a quick and clean escape along this path. This was not panic, but a brazen demonstration of strength. Before finally immersing himself in the hunt, Ivan allowed himself one last look at the official version, turning back to the winter hut. He remembered the sledgehammer, a heavy, powerful tool that, according to Prokhorov, was the murder weapon. But a sledgehammer would require a swing, which would give the victims time to react and defend themselves. With that amount of blood and wounds, there should have been much more torn traces of struggle on the walls, furniture, and clothing. Not just staged chaos. The weapon was most likely different, sharper, more accurate, inflicting instant, shocking damage that did not even allow the victim to scream. The sledgehammer was planted as the most obvious and understandable clue for a lazy investigator. Voron completely dismissed this version. It was too simple, too dirty, and, most importantly, it did not correspond to the clean, almost surgical work he saw inside the winter hut. Ivan began a slow, methodical ascent, step by step, reconstructing the psychological chronology of the victim's last hours. He recalled the little things he had seen: a deck of cards thrown down in haste, an unfinished, almost full glass of tea, and most importantly, a pack of expensive city cigarettes carelessly wrapped in dirty rags. These were signs of sudden nervous wealth. These people were not poor saboteurs who rejoice at every gram they find. They must have found something big, something that caused an instant surge of greed and, as a result, paranoid nervousness. Sudden wealth in the wilderness always breeds suspicion. They were most likely sitting, discussing, dividing, and their attention was focused on the gold, not the door. They became vulnerable because their minds were consumed by the virus of greed. The shadow moving ahead behaved perfectly. He did not rush forward, but walked as if on an invisible thread, tied to the killer's route. It was a path chosen not by a fugitive, but by a hunter who wanted to get out of the noise zone as quickly and quietly as possible, and hide in that part of the taiga where no one would find him. The killer did not try to cover his tracks. He simply chose a path that guaranteed that no one would dare follow him. This was not the psychology of survival in fear, but of absolute superiority, bordering on contempt for those left behind. Raven realized that the killer was not running away, but leaving, taking his prey with him. But his prey was not gold. If gold had been his goal, he would not have wasted precious minutes staging a scene. He would have simply killed, taken the bars, and left along the gentle path. Raven, remembering the dirty, empty winter quarters, came to the only logical conclusion. Gold was undoubtedly the cause of the miners' deaths, but not the killer's goal. The killer, a man driven by a code rather than greed, had taken something else, something that had value not in financial terms, but perhaps in terms of information or symbolism. It could have been evidence of their criminal activities, a map, a diary, or, most alarmingly, some kind of tool. The slope was getting steeper, making Raven breathe heavily, but his mind was working as clearly as ever. He reconstructed the chronology. The prospectors, euphoric from their sudden wealth and, at the same time, in a state of extreme nervous tension, were sitting in their winter hut. The killer arrived. He doesn't burst in, but enters, catching them off guard. Perhaps he was known to them. He strikes with precise, quick blows. Then he stages a scene with a sledgehammer and scattered belongings. And then, most importantly, he calmly climbs the hill instead of quickly fleeing downhill. A person who acts this way is not afraid. He's confident that no one can catch him. His prey is not a bag of metal, but the completion of a ritual, the restoration of order. Reaching the top, Raven stopped. Here, on a small, mossy platform, there was a view of the entire Malaya Kurumka, and, more importantly, from here he could clearly see the path he had climbed. The criminal stood here, looking down at his victims and at the police bustling about. He enjoyed his immunity. At the edge of the clearing, Ivan noticed a mark. Not a footprint, but something that had been briefly leaned against a rock. A perfectly clean, rectangular mark that resembled neither a weapon nor an ordinary backpack. It was a mark left by invisible, sophisticated equipment. The Raven realized that this was not just a lone wolf. There was something more than personal revenge behind it, and that something required special equipment. This trail, leading up the hill, was not just an escape route. It was a path that led to the solution. The Raven raised his head and looked at the dense, impenetrable forest that began just beyond the clearing. His hunt had only just begun, and it was leading him not after the killer, but after what he had taken. It wasn't gold. It was the truth.
I must go back down to the winter camp to confirm my suspicions, Raven decided mentally, looking down from the very clearing where the killer had stopped to enjoy his impunity.
The descent down the steep, slippery, moss-covered slope was even more dangerous than the ascent, but Ivan moved with astonishing, almost cat-like grace, completely merging with the shadow into a single entity.
He didn't need lanterns or trails.
His body knew this land, and his mind was occupied solely with the search for the very booty that the criminal had taken instead of gold.
Obvious clues are always traps, and Prokhorov with his sledgehammer had undoubtedly fallen into this trap. The real truth is always found on the periphery, in what seems unimportant or unnoticed. When they returned to the winter camp, the commotion had subsided slightly. Prokhorov, clearly wanting to close this unpleasant episode as soon as possible, was already giving orders to pack up. Fomin, however, looked nervous and was desperately waiting for Ivan's return. It was as if he felt that his only hope for the truth was connected precisely with this unsociable man who had appeared from the taiga. Well, Artem Sergeyevich,
What is the logic of your taiga maniac? Prokhorov addressed Voron with poorly concealed irony, as if he were addressing a village eccentric.
The logic is clearer than yours, Prokhorov. Ivan's voice was low and completely calm, which instantly silenced the investigator. I need the backpacks. The backpacks of the victims.
and their personal belongings, which have not yet been recorded in the protocol and taken away. Prokhorov shrugged, allowing Fomin to escort Ivan to the winter quarters. He didn't care. The former investigator, now just a hunter, would find nothing. And that would only confirm that he, Prokhorov, was right. The backpacks, neatly stacked in the corner, smelled of sweat, mold, and cheap tobacco. It was here that Voron began his real analysis. He wasn't looking for signs of a struggle or fingerprints. He was looking for the character, scale, and true goals of these people. The first backpack belonged, judging by the clothes, to the largest of the dead. Inside were the usual things: some dry food, dirty socks, spare cartridges for a hunting rifle, which incidentally was standing in the corner, unused.
But then Ivan pulled out something unusual for a lone shabashnik. A small moisture-proof case. Inside were thin-walled laboratory test tubes and several bags with rock samples. Next to it was a pocket-sized but incredibly accurate electronic weighing device that could measure fractions of a milligram. This was not equipment for panning for gold. It was equipment for geological exploration and analysis. Expensive and specialized. They weren't just digging, Fomin. They were analyzing.
They had precise coordinates, and they knew what they were looking for. Ivan said quietly, as if reciting a spell. No lone prospector, working for himself, would bring such expensive toys here. He would buy a cheap metal detector and a pan. These prospectors had serious city money behind them. Very serious. One of the prospectors, Alexei, according to the documents found, had previously worked for a construction company in the regional center. Another, Victor, was a former mechanic. And the third, Dmitri, had military bearing and most likely served as security. This group was not a random gathering of people. It was a mobile, well-funded, and most importantly, well-equipped team. Ivan started with the third backpack, which belonged to Dmitri, the security guard. Inside there was only dry rations and a spare battery for something powerful. But here, at the bottom, Voron found what he was looking for. Not gold, not a gun, but a barely noticeable, perfectly clean mark
left on the inside wall of the backpack. It was an imprint of a rectangular case, approximately 30 by 40 centimeters in size.
The imprint was shallow, but very clear, as if the same object had always been placed in that spot, and its body was perfectly clean, without any tiger dirt or scratches. This meant that the object was protected, packed in an additional case, and incredibly valuable. It wasn't a bag of gold. Voron looked up at Fomin. It was a tool, an expensive, sophisticated tool.
Perhaps a portable spectral analyzer that instantly determines the composition of rock, or a very powerful ground-penetrating radar, something they used to find the vein they were looking for. And that tool is not here. The killer took it. That's why he went up the mountain. He wasn't carrying heavy ingots, but a single, large, priceless device. The gold was the bait, the reason, but not the goal. The goal of the killer, a man who apparently knew about the miners' illegal activities, was to seize this equipment. The murder was a way to stop the exploration and destroy the traces of corporate intrusion. This man was not only restoring justice, but also conducting a counterintelligence operation on behalf of TAIGA. It was an act of ecological retribution carried out with military precision. Fomin looked at the clean print in his backpack with growing horror. But why? Why did he need the analyzer? Why not the gold? And who is this man who so easily kills 3 people and takes the device? This is no longer everyday life, Ivan. This is. It's city money and corporate interests that have come to the TAIGA under the guise of saboteurs. Voron interrupted him. The miners were just pawns, and the killer took out the pawns to take the queen. The information stored in that device. And he couldn't carry it far into the forest without risking damage. He needed a place where he could, first, quickly hide, and second, contact the person who sent him, or the person to whom he wanted to pass on the information. Ivan left the winter hut, leaving Fomin alone with this suddenly revealed, complex truth. He looked again at the slope where the killer had gone, and this time his gaze was firm and determined. He knew where to go next. Within a radius of 50 kilometers from the winter hut, there was only one facility that could serve as a temporary base for such equipment. An old, semi-abandoned geologist settlement left over from a large Soviet project 30 years ago. The settlement, nicknamed Well 2 by the locals, had several preserved, albeit dilapidated hangars, and, most importantly, an access road that could be used for quick evacuation or rendezvous. Well 2, Voron said, as if putting an end to this episode. We're going there, Shadow. Let's go. The city games are starting. But according to the rules of the TAIGA, he didn't tell Fomin that this hunt was already turning into a silent rivalry between him and the killer. Both were outcasts. Both lived by a code different from the criminal code, and both fought for justice, but by different methods. Now Ivan had to figure out whether this loner was a fighter for nature or just an avenger who used a grand idea as an excuse for his murders. And the answer was most likely waiting for him at Well 2. Ivan couldn't arrest Fomin, but he could use his resources and his fear to get to the truth. Voron stepped from the clearing into the forest. He had to get to the old base faster than the killer could get away with his prey forever. Ivan didn't use Captain Fomin as his personal transport, but he didn't pass up the opportunity to save time. He told him to drive along the old abandoned logging road that led to Well 2, while he turned into the forest, moving parallel to the road. The killer, of course, would not have gone straight down the road. But he would not have gone too far into the thicket either, so as not to damage his precious stolen device. It was a game on the edge. Raven knew that this man was a master of disguise, but he also knew that professional pride often prevents a person from resorting to obvious, panicked measures. He moved with confidence, and that confidence was his main clue. The shadow walked ahead unhurriedly, almost meditatively, but his nose never stopped working. Raven wasn't looking for boot prints. He was looking for subtle disturbances in the taiga. Broken, recently dry twigs that couldn't have broken on their own. Grass flattened under the weight of a load that had not yet had time to straighten up. Small stone displaced from its place, which a person had thrown down in a hurry. All these were traces not intended for the eyes, but for the sense of smell, for a person who could see not only shapes, but also intentions. And what he saw confirmed his initial guess. The killer was not disguised. He simply moved so cleanly and quickly that the trail itself became part of the natural landscape, blending in with it, not attracting the attention of those who were not looking deeply. It was the behavior of a master who knows that he is untouchable on his territory. Almost 3 hours had passed when Raven sensed that they were deviating from the most logical route to the former geological base. The shadow turned sharply to the left, toward what the map indicated should be nothing but impenetrable thickets and rocky outcrops. Raven did not argue. He completely trusted his dog's instincts, which, he believed, sensed not just the smell of a person, but their psychological trail, their emotions, tension, and purpose. It was an almost mystical unity with nature, which Raven called his method. He wasn't just looking for the criminal. He was looking for their motive, their inner code that had brought them here. The path became really difficult. They pushed through dense cedar undergrowth, slid down scree slopes, but Shadow continued to lead him without slowing down. Finally, the thick forest parted, and Voron found himself at the edge of a cliff, from where a view opened up that instantly made him stop. Before him lay a dead, disfigured place. Once upon a time, a large taiga river flowed here, serving as a spawning ground and source of life for the entire area. Now all that remained of it was a pitiful, dirty stream that barely crawled along the center of a wide, silt and boulder-strewn riverbed. The reason for this disaster was obvious. An old, dilapidated concrete dam, built back in Soviet times for logging, now stood as a monument to human pride and short-sightedness. The dam had been abandoned, but its concrete power continued to cripple nature. All the water that once fed the river had gone underground or been redirected, leaving behind a dry, dead valley, covered with cracks. This was a place where the natural balance had not simply been disturbed, but destroyed. And this was where the killer's trail had led him. It couldn't have been a coincidence. The Raven descended to the dam itself. Its walls were covered with green moss, as if nature was trying to heal the wound inflicted by concrete. The shadow approached the edge of the former spillway and whimpered quietly, as if expressing a dull, animalistic sadness. Ivan leaned his palm against the cold, rough concrete and felt a sudden, sharp connection between the killer, this dead river, and the dead prospectors. The miners had come to dig for gold. To find the metal, they used powerful, specialized equipment, disturbing the topsoil, polluting the water, and destroying the environment. They were the direct heirs of the philosophy that had once built this dam, the philosophy that man has the right to take whatever he needs from nature, without paying any price. They were merely the instrument that had disrupted the sacred natural balance.
Ivan looked at the stream, which should have been a full-flowing river, and understood the criminal's motive. It was not personal revenge for stolen wealth or an old quarrel. It was ecological revenge. The killer undoubtedly knew this river, perhaps grew up near it, saw it dying under the onslaught of civilization and greed. And when new, greedy people came to his forest, bringing with them even more destructive technologies, he decided that justice, which had failed to protect this river, must be carried out by his own hands.
The murdered prospectors were only the latest, most obvious symbol of this greed, and their murder was not a criminal act in the pure sense, but an act of retribution, of vengeance, which was supposed to restore order. Voron remembered the mark on the stone he had found near the winter hut. It was not just a signature. It was a warning. You have crossed the line, and there will be a price to pay. The criminal did not hide because he believed he was right. He moved with pride, as if fulfilling the highest, natural code of justice. Ivan ran his hand over the concrete of the dam, and his old, cynical disbelief wavered. He himself had gone into the taiga because he was disappointed in human law, which turned out to be too corrupt and weak to protect the weak and punish the strong. And this loner, this cleaner, simply took on the job that the whole system should have done, restoring balance. But he did it in the most radical and criminal way possible. His prey is not gold, Shadow, Raven whispered to the dog. His prey is the right to judge, and we are following that right. They moved on, skirting the dead riverbed. Now Ivan knew that he was looking not only for traces of the man, but also for his philosophy. He was sure that the killer had not simply left, but had prepared a message for him. He was waiting for him. And ahead, on the way to Well 2, they were bound to find the next sign. Even felt the tension of the hunter give way to the tension of the one being led. He had crossed an unspoken line. Now he was not following the criminal, but walking toward him, and the next step would reveal how far this man had gone in his right to justice. They moved along the dead riverbed, which stretched across the taiga like a huge white scar. After discovering the dam and realizing the killer's motive, the hunt ceased to be simply a search for a criminal. It turned into a silent, tense dialogue between two people who seemed to speak the same language, but had chosen diametrically opposite paths. Raven felt that the killer, this cleaner, was in no hurry to leave. He was walking deliberately, slowly, as if inviting him to catch up. His path lay through the wildest parts of the forest, where there were no old logging roads or even animal trails, only rocks, moss, and dense, thorny undergrowth. Less than an hour had passed since they left the ruined dam behind, when Raven encountered his first greeting. The shadow walking ahead along the edge of the thick rose bushes suddenly stopped, its powerful body frozen like a taut bowstring. He did not growl, but his ears twitched back and his nostrils flared, catching something that carried the scent of a foreign, very distinct will. Raven stopped a meter away from him. Between two trunks of dry larch trees, at waist level, was stretched a thin, almost invisible fishing line. It was not intended to knock down or injure, but only to cause a stumble, to draw attention. If Raven or Shadow had stumbled upon it, there would have been a dull sound that would have carried 100 meters in the silence. It was an alarm set for an uninvited guest. Raven crouched down, took out a knife, and carefully cut the line. The way it was secured left no doubt. The work of a professional. The knots were clean and secure,
and the line was stretched neither too high nor too low, but at a level where a person accustomed to looking down at their feet in search of a path would be sure to miss it. But someone accustomed to reading the air and branches would notice. It was a trap designed not for a passerby, but for a specialist. This was the killer's first silent question. Who are you? And why are you following me? 50 steps later, at the foot of a large boulder, Raven discovered the second element. On top of the rock lay 3 small, perfectly smooth stones stacked in a pyramid. In itself, this structure was quite natural. Gamekeepers, hunters, and geologists did this to mark a route. But this pyramid was placed on its edge, on a point of equilibrium. A light touch would have been enough to make it collapse, and the stones, rolling down the slope, would have made a characteristic TAIGA noise. It was another alarm, another warning, and it was also empty. The killer did not want to kill. He wanted to delay, warn, or, most incredibly, test. "He's playing with us, Shadow," Raven whispered. He dismantled the pyramid, carefully placing the stones in his pocket. It was not an escape, but a deliberate slowdown, so that whoever was following could catch up. It was a psychological challenge that Raven, himself a master of such games, could not ignore. His opponent was not afraid of the law, not afraid of pursuit. He seemed to be expecting it. And he knew perfectly well that it was not the city police who would come after him, but someone who understood the language of the forest.
Voron began to reconstruct a psychological portrait of this man. Only a former reserve employee, a top-class gamekeeper, or perhaps a former special forces instructor who had spent many years in this wilderness could leave such traces. These traps spoke not of hatred, but of knowledge. Knowledge of the psychology of pursuit, knowledge of the terrain, and, most importantly, knowledge of him, Ivan Belov. At that moment, a sharp psychological conflict flared up inside Voron. He remembered how, as an investigator of particularly important cases, he often felt powerless against a system that allowed large-scale poachers and corrupt officials to get away with it. He remembered his despair when he had to turn a blind eye to obvious violations in order to please his superiors or corporate interests. It was this disappointment in human law that had brought him to this wilderness, to Voron's life. And now he was following a man who had converted that disappointment into action, into blood, into his own cruel code of natural justice. "The killer is a man of my mentality," Ivan thought, squinting. He just crossed a line that I didn't dare to cross. He decided that the law of the TAIGA is more important than the criminal code. And now he's testing me. Am I ready for this myself? The next signal was more subtle. At the spot where the killer's trail seemed to disappear among the pile of stones, Shadow raised his head and pointed his nose upward, toward the crown of an old, sprawling spruce tree. The raven looked up and could barely make out a thin bronze wire in the branches, fixed so that a ray of sunlight breaking through the clouds would reflect off it and strike the eyes of anyone following. The wire was tuned like a perfect mirror, but it was so carefully camouflaged by the branches that it could only be seen from a certain angle and with a great deal of concentration. If Raven had been just a tired man following a trail, he would have missed this signal and most likely ended up in the next trap, which might not have been a warning. Ivan did not touch the wire. He simply walked around the spruce tree in a wide arc. He understood. The killer was not just checking, he was communicating. He did not want to be pursued by just any police officer. He wanted to be pursued by Raven, a man capable of understanding his motives.
These traps without victims were, in essence, questions. Do you see my goal? Do you understand why I did it?
Are you ready to judge me not by the letter of the law, but by your conscience?
Ivan felt the tension turn into an almost painful anticipation. He was following a shadow that seemed to be his own, more radical reflection.
The loner who cleanses the taiga of greedy people acts according to a code.
He does not steal gold, but takes away the weapon of destruction, the geoanalyzer. And now, as if in a nightly duel, he challenges his only worthy opponent to a conversation.
He remembered how Fomin said that murder was like a massacre, but without logic. For Prokhorov, it was barbaric. For Voron, it was cold-blooded logic. The killer did not simply take lives. He performed a ritual of retribution. And now he was ready to explain his philosophy to someone who could share it. Ivan despised violence, but he could not despise the motive. Twilight was falling. Voron and Shadow came out onto an old, overgrown clearing, where gamekeepers had probably stopped in the past. And here, in the middle of the clearing, stood the last, most eloquent trap. On a tall stump, felled by the wind, perfectly clean and level, lay a book. It was an old, worn volume by a Russian philosopher, with a bookmark in it. The book was dry, protected from moisture, as if it had been left there very recently. It was not a hint. It was a direct appeal. The killer knew that only a person capable of understanding the depth of his motives would stop to read it. He wanted Raven to know that his motive lay not in crime, but in a deep moral and philosophical conflict with the modern world. Raven picked up the book. It was the very line he had to cross to understand his pursuer. The book, left on a stump in the middle of a taiga glade, was an old edition, its spine worn by time and moisture. It was a volume by a Russian philosopher, written at the beginning of the 20th century, about morality and ethics in a crisis of faith. Raven opened it, holding it only by the edges with his fingers so as not to leave any unnecessary marks. The page, marked with a dry fern leaf, contained an underlined paragraph stating that true justice is not forgiveness, but the restoration of the broken order. Voron felt the cold metal he had sensed from the cold-blooded killer give way to something more complex. Scorched idealism. The killer wasn't just seeking revenge. He was justifying himself with a philosophy that he himself had turned upside down. He was looking for understanding. And he knew that Raven, the only one who could get here, would be able to understand him. Ivan closed the book. The traps set along the way were tests. And the book was the key. The criminal he was pursuing was not a gangster, but a man who once believed in the system, and then became disillusioned with it once and for all. Raven knew people like that. He saw people like that in the mirror every day. He felt a sharp, almost physical pain from the realization that he himself could have chosen this path if he had not found another way out in this wilderness. The tension of the hunt was replaced by the heaviness of internal, moral judgment. They moved on, and now the trail had changed. After the message, the traps disappeared, and the criminal began to move at an open, undisguised speed, as if he had cast aside all doubts. He moved along the ridges, using his intuition and knowledge of the terrain, which gave him an advantage. An hour and a half later, Shadow led Raven to their night's lodging. It was a small, dry niche under a rock overhang, perfectly hidden from rain and wind. Raven assessed the camp. It was the pinnacle of survival skills. The fire was tiny, about the size of a palm, lit in a pit lined with stones. This allowed for maximum heat with minimal smoke and light. The firewood was selected exclusively from dry, clean deadwood that did not crackle or spark. There was no trash, no trampled grass, not even traces of squatting around it. The man did not sit. He stood or lay down, not allowing himself to relax for a second. This camp spoke of total control, of professional skill that money cannot buy, and most importantly, it spoke of a complete absence of fear. A person who sleeps and cooks for himself alone in the wild taiga is not afraid of animals or people. He is only afraid of losing to himself. Voron crouched down by the extinguished, long burnt-out campfire. He carefully raked through the ashes with the tip of his knife and found what he was looking for. Not bones or cartridges, but a trace of that very rectangular, stolen device that the killer had placed here at night. The mark was perfectly even, and next to it, on a piece of the burnt but not yet charred trunk, Raven saw it. A second mark. It was identical to the one he had found on the stone near the winter hut. The same inverted Z with an additional short stroke. But here, on the soft wood, it was carved deeper and more clearly. It was a personal seal, a signature, and she finally had a name. At that moment, time ceased to exist for Ivan Bielov. His muscles cramped, but he didn't notice. He felt an icy chill run down his spine, which had nothing to do with the October taiga. He knew this mark. He had seen this mark 7 years ago on the old, burnt door of the guardhouse, when his former colleague left, leaving behind not only ashes, but also burnt bridges. This seal belonged to Marat. Marat Ayupov. Marat. Memories flooded over Voron like a mountain stream awakened by a spring shower. Marat had been his partner when they both served in the reserve's operations department, before they went their separate ways. Marat was a pure, uncompromising idealist, a man who believed in the sanctity of the taiga more than in human life. He was the son of a local gamekeeper, knew the forest like the back of his hand, but at the same time, possessed an amazing, almost academic mind. Marat, Ivan whispered. You went all the way after all. Ivan remembered their last conversation, which took place a few weeks before Marat left. They were sitting in a dirty dining room, discussing a case of illegal logging that had been hushed up after a call from above. Marat, banging his fist on the table, said that the system was rotten to the core, that the law they had sworn to uphold had become a tool for poachers and corrupt officials. They're not just buying the forest, Ivan. They're buying our conscience. And if the law can't protect the taiga, then the taiga must protect itself. And I will be its weapon. Voron tried to talk him out of it, saying you can't cross that line. That once you start taking justice into your own hands, there's no stopping. But Marat was no longer listening. He resigned amid scandal, accusing the management of corruption, and disappeared, as if he had dissolved into the very taiga he loved so fanatically. Since then, Raven had heard nothing more about him, except for vague rumors about some fugitive gamekeeper who was carrying out acts of revenge against poachers here and there. Now he understood. Marat wasn't just taking revenge. He had become the living embodiment of the very code of natural justice he had spoken of.
The dead prospectors were not people to him, but a disease that he, as a surgeon, was obliged to cut out.
And the seizure of the expensive geoanalyzer was not theft, but the elimination of a tool capable of causing irreparable damage to his forest. The raven rose. It was not someone else's trail, but his own bitter choice, which he now had to pursue.
He could not allow Marat to continue his personal war. Too much idealism, too much rage, too much blood. He had to understand what Marat had taken with him, along with the geoanalyzer, and what his next target was. Raven felt that his former colleague was aiming higher than just 3 prospectors. Well 2 was the last bastion of civilization in this region. That was where they were headed.
Raven had to catch up with him to understand what Marat's next, higher blow to the system would be, and his heart sank with the realization that they were heading for a confrontation where they would have to judge each other.
He quickly turned around, leaving this perfectly clean, but frighteningly lifeless camp. Shadow, sensing the sudden surge of adrenaline and tension in his master, jerked forward, ready for the final chase. The Raven and the Shadow now moved along Marat's trail, not as hunter and prey, but as 2 old, bitter memories moving toward an inevitable confrontation. Knowing his name, knowing his motive, Marat Ayupov, a former idealist who had become a fanatical enforcer of the natural code, did not make the journey easier, but rather more difficult. This was not an investigation of a crime, but a trial of his own past. Ivan knew that his task was no longer to arrest his friend, but to understand at what cost Marat was willing to restore justice, and what he would do next.
His former colleague had taken not gold, but a geoanalyzer, which indicated that Marat was aiming for a bigger, corporate game. They approached the foot of Well 2.
It was an abandoned, half-rotten geologist's settlement, consisting of several barracks, hangars, and a central brick hut that had once housed the administration. Now there was an atmosphere of decay. The windows were broken, the roofs had collapsed, and everything that could be carried away had been taken. But it was this place, thanks to its relative accessibility by transport and the presence of strong walls, that could serve as an ideal transshipment base. Ivan had no doubt that Marat had to stop here. The Shadow, who had been walking tensely alert all this time, suddenly crouched down and let out a quiet but insistent whine. He did not point to a trail on the ground, but pointed his muzzle at a strange, barely noticeable willow bush growing at the very base of the ruined water tower. It was a completely illogical place for a hiding place. Too open, too close to what had once been a road, and too obvious. But Raven trusted the dog's instincts. Marat, like himself, knew that the best camouflage was something that seemed completely ordinary and uninteresting. Voron cautiously approached the bush. At first, he saw nothing but thick, grey willow branches and tangled roots.
But then, looking down, he noticed that one of the branches was unnaturally thicker than the others at the base. He carefully pushed the branches aside and found a wooden, homemade box in the ground between the roots, under a layer of thin turf. It was roughly knocked together, but tightly sealed. Marat would not have hidden the geoanalyzer here, too valuable and fragile a cargo to carry with him. So it must have been something he no longer needed, but did not want to leave in plain sight. Ivan carefully opened the box with a knife. Inside, wrapped in several layers of thick, oiled canvas, were items that completely changed his perception of the crime. There was no gold, no bundles of cash, and no murder weapon. There were only folders with papers, a thin, hardcover notebook, and several printed glossy photographs. Voron unfolded the photographs. They showed 3 murdered prospectors. They did not look like dirty, exhausted workers from the wilderness. They were photographed in an expensive, sun-drenched Moscow office,
surrounded by maps, charts, and people in formal suits. In the background, barely visible, hung the emblem of a large geological exploration company, whose name Ivan couldn't immediately remember, but it sounded grand and corporate. These photos were taken long before they ended up in the taiga. Then Voron opened the folders. Inside were photocopies of official documents. Geological exploration licenses that had been issued for legal sites, but under the cover of which illegal mining was being carried out. There were also detailed financial reports showing how much money had been invested in the expedition, how much profit was expected, and most importantly, internal memos. These memos directly linked to Moscow Geological Exploration Company, specializing in the development of Siberian mineral resources, with 3 saboteurs in the taiga wilderness. The prospectors were merely pawns, hired to obtain a control sample, proving that the vein was indeed worth billions. Ivan understood the complexity of Marat's operation. The murder of the prospectors was only a means to an end, part of a larger, strategic strike. Marat eliminated them to stop the extraction, removed the threat, and the seizure of the geoanalyzer was a guarantee that the corporation would not be able to quickly continue its work, because their queen, the tool for accurate analysis, had been destroyed or captured. And this cache, containing documents and photographs, was his real prize, his information. He opened a thin notebook, which turned out to be Marat's personal diary. The handwriting was neat, but nervous. The last entries had been made just a few days ago.
Marat wrote not about gold, but about retribution, about the disease of greed, and about how these people, the corporate officials behind the miners, deserved to be brought to justice. He planned not just to kill, but to expose.
He wanted the whole country to see how a large, respected company used crime and dirty methods to plunder natural resources. The murder was part of the operation. The real goal was to expose corporate greed, Voron said, his voice dull and tired.
Marat was aiming higher than 3 dead miners. He was targeting those who sat in Moscow offices, those who bought conscience and the law.
He used crime as a public act of protest, as a way to restore order in a region that had been poisoned by money and corruption. Ivan carefully put the box back in its place so as not to damage it, and camouflaged the hiding place. He knew that Marat had left these documents here for a reason. He had left them for him. He had given him, Voron, a choice. Either bury this evidence and continue hunting the killer according to the letter of the law, or take up his mission and use this booty to strike back at the system. Voron stood up. Night was falling.
The sky above the taiga had become dark and heavy. Now he had to find Marat to figure out what his next, most dangerous move would be. He was sure that Marat Yupov was not going to stop, and his next target was undoubtedly somewhere in this semi-abandoned village. After Ivan camouflaged the hiding place with the documents, the hunt entered its final, most intense phase.
Now, it was not just a chase along the trail, but a race against time and against himself. Ivan knew that Marat, having obtained the geoanalyzer and gotten rid of the unnecessary papers, had headed for the only logistics point in the area, an abandoned warehouse near Black Waterfall. This waterfall, named for the dark basalt rock over which the water crashed, was located in the most remote part of the reserve, but it had an old, barely noticeable road leading to the city.
It was the perfect place to meet, exchange gold for money, or, more likely in Marat's case, to hand over his booty to those who could use it for public exposure. The Raven understood that if he didn't catch up with Marat before he reached this point,
it would all be over. Marat would disappear, and his information bomb would explode, leading to unpredictable consequences, including a full-scale corporate war in the region. Yvon had to stop him, not because Marat was a criminal, but because his justice was too one-sided, too bloody, and too personal. Justice bought at the price of murder always leaves a bitter aftertaste. The path to the waterfall was long and extremely difficult. Raven deliberately avoided the main, albeit abandoned, roads, walking along hidden hunting trails that were known only to a few.
He had laid these trails himself many years ago, while still in service, and was sure that Marat knew them just as well.
It was a silent, exhausting duel, where every step, every choice of route was a decision made based on a deep understanding of the opponent's psychology. Ivan moved as quickly as possible, forcing his tired body to work to its limit. He did not allow himself to rest for more than 10 minutes at a time, only taking short sips of cold water and exchanging silent glances with Shadow. The dog, sensing his master's passion, walked steadily, as if unaware of fatigue, his instincts being the only thing that helped Raven stay on track in the thick pre-dawn fog. The tension grew with every step, transforming into an internal conflict. Voron, a former law enforcement officer, now found himself in the role of a lawbreaker. He had hidden the evidence, the cache of documents that was supposed to be handed over to Fomin, in order to continue his personal hunt. He had broken his own rules about the sanctity of the law. He realized that his actions no longer had anything to do with the police. He followed his friend to prevent not just a crime, but a catastrophe that could be caused by the disclosure of corporate secrets obtained at the cost of 3 lives. He understood that in this situation, no one's hands were clean. And despite all his principles, his hands would not remain clean either. After about an hour of walking, Shadow stopped abruptly, his fur standing on end again. But this time not from aggression, but from anxiety. The Raven froze. Ahead, on the narrow path where the descent to the waterfall began, he saw something that made his heart sink. Freshly cleared dead wood. Someone had recently cleared the passage. This was no ordinary trail. It was a deliberate act. Marat, either feeling tired and wanting to make his path easier, or, more likely, wanting Raven to catch up with him, had removed the obstacle. It was a silent invitation. Ivan felt rage rising inside him.
Marat was playing with him like a pawn on a chessboard. He was demonstrating his superiority in physical fitness and knowledge of the forest. But most importantly, he was demonstrating his moral position.
He seemed to be saying, "You, Ivan, can follow the law, but the law is a swamp, and I am on the straight path of justice. Choose." Making his way through the cleared area, Ivan analyzed the situation once again. If Marat was really aiming for public exposure, then he must have established contact with the city. The geoanalyzer he was carrying most likely contained key information, the exact coordinates and composition of the vein. This information needed to be passed on to journalists or independent experts so that his retribution would have maximum resonance. The warehouse by the waterfall was the only place with relatively stable, albeit weak, cell phone reception, or the possibility of using satellite equipment. The Raven picked up his pace. He had to catch up with him before Marat took his final, possibly irreversible, step. He felt that they were heading for an inevitable confrontation that would not resemble an arrest or a fight. It would be a clash of 2 codes, 2 worldviews, where both would judge each other. Raven would judge Marat for violating human law, and Marat would judge Raven for his silent consent to the corruption of the system. A low-growing rumble appeared. It was a waterfall. A black waterfall. It was already close, its noise, like the pulse of the taiga, growing louder and louder. Ivan stopped to catch his breath one last time. He took out the old, trusty carbine that was always with him, but he wasn't sure he could shoot someone who was his friend, and whose motives, albeit fanatical, he understood. "Let's go, Shadow," Raven said quietly, his voice hoarse with tension. Ahead, through the wet branches, a dim light was already breaking through. And he knew that this encounter would change them both forever. The roar of the black waterfall, which at first had been a distant growing background noise, now crashed down on them with deafening power, as if the tiger itself had decided to drown out the voice of human law. The warehouse was a crooked, half-demolished concrete slab building located on a small, secluded site. There was no one around, no cars, no traces of a recent campfire, no signs of third parties. Marat was waiting for him. Ivan stopped at the edge of the forest, 100 meters from the warehouse. He raised his hand, ordering Tenna to freeze. The dog, tense to the limit, lay down on his belly, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the concrete structure. Voron dropped his backpack, checked his rifle, and, leaving his weapon behind, slowly emerged from the shadows of the trees. He walked forward, completely exposed, without a bulletproof vest or cover, relying solely on the fact that Marat, his former friend, would not shoot him in the back. "Marat," Raven's voice was firm and clear, despite the roar of the water. The answer came instantly, but not from the warehouse. Marat was sitting on a flat, wet boulder, just 20 meters from the entrance, with water foaming and roaring behind him. He was dressed in a dark, inconspicuous taiga suit, and a hunting knife lay on his knees, its blade glinting with a dull, dangerous light. Nearby, neatly wrapped in thick cloth, stood the very same geo-analyzer stolen from the murdered prospectors. Marat looked neither like a fugitive nor a hunted animal. He was calm and focused, like a stone statue. "I knew you would come, Ivan." Marat's voice was deep and even, without malice or remorse. Only quiet, fanatical conviction. "Your conscience would not let you rest. You're not like Prokhorov, not like Fomin. You listened to TAIGA." Voron took 10 steps forward and stopped, keeping a distance that allowed them both to feel safe. "Your justice is too bloody, Marat. You killed 3 people. That's not the TAIGA code. That's murder." Marat shook his head gently. He lifted a piece of thick, dark fabric, and Raven saw. On the fabric, folded in several layers, lay small but heavy ingots. Gold. It was only a small part, but it was enough to prove that the prospectors had indeed found a vein. They died for this greed, Ivan, for this yellow metal that turns people into beasts and disfigures the earth. Marat slowly ran his finger over the cold ingot. These 3, Dmitri, Alexei, Victor. They weren't just simple laborers. They were mercenaries for a large Moscow company who knew what they were getting into. I gave them a choice. I asked them to leave the geoanalyzer behind, and never come back. They laughed. They said they had city rules. You saw how they lived, Ivan. A pile of trash, young people burning fires, a river disfigured by dredging. They brought a cancerous tumor into our reserve, and I cut it out.
And what are you doing for the sake of order?
You sit in your house and pretend not to hear the tiger screaming. The dialogue shifted to a philosophical plane, where the criminal code lay on one side of the scales, and a personal understanding of redemption on the other.
Voron saw how Marat burned with his righteousness. His eyes burned with a feverish, dangerous fire. I don't justify their greed, Marat. I judge your method. Murder is always a defeat.
You have become what you fought against. You have become violence. Ivan replied, his voice tense as a drawn bowstring. Analyzer, the documents you left in the hiding place are your justification, your public trial. You want me to find them.
You want me to finish your work, but with cleaner hands. Marat smiled, and in that smile there was neither joy nor warmth, only weary, bitter sadness.
You're right. Murder is filth. But sometimes filth is the only way to clean up the swamp.
I'm not asking you to justify me. I'm asking you not to bury the truth. Here. Take a look. Marat carefully took a small, moisture-proof flash drive from his pocket. He threw it at Ivan's feet.
The flash drive fell into the moss, barely missing the water.
It's all there, Ivan. Data from the GeoAnalyzer, the exact coordinates of the deposits, and, most importantly, an audio recording of their last conversation, where they discuss how they bribed officials in Moscow and how they planned to quickly cover up the traces.
Evidence of corruption and criminal activity by the company. I was going to give it to the media. Now, it's your prize. Your weapon. The climax had arrived. The roar of the waterfall seemed deafening.
Marat presented Voron with not just a choice, but a real moral dilemma. Now choose, Ivan. You have the flash drive. You have the gold. You can arrest me. And then your police, your Prokhorovs, will immediately classify this information so as not to harm the respected people in the capital. And then my sacrifice will be in vain. Or you can follow the TAIGA code.
You take this flash drive and do what the law should have done. Restore balance. Expose them and let me go.
You must understand that the most important thing for me is not my life, but my truth. Marat picked up the knife from his knees, not in a threatening manner, but in a symbolic pose.
Are you for the criminal code that is for sale, or for order that must be restored at any cost?
Voron looked at the flash drive lying in the moss. He saw in it not just data, but a reflection of his own disappointment, which had driven him into this wilderness. He despised the system, but was always afraid to cross the line.
And Marat, his former friend, had crossed it with fanatical determination. Now he, Ivan Belov, had to make a choice that would forever determine who he was. A man of the law, or the raven. A judge living by the TAIGA code.
The roar of water behind Marat was not just a sound. It was a wall erected by the TAIGA to isolate their dialogue from the rest of the world, from corrupt officials and laws that could be circumvented. The flash drive lay in the wet moss, just a few steps away from Ivan. It was not just a microchip, but a symbol, tangible proof of the rotten system they both hated. Marat, with a feverish gleam in his eyes, waited.
He had presented him with the most difficult choice of his life. Arrest his friend and bury the truth, or let the killer go so that the truth could prevail.
Ivan did not move. It seemed to him that he was standing on the edge of an abyss, and under his feet was not just moss, but hundreds of meters of doubt. He remembered how, 10 years ago, he had left the investigation when his last major corruption case had been hushed up in the capital. Back then, Ivan Belov still believed in the letter of the law, in the idea that justice was a clearly defined process that could not be violated. He fled to the taiga to avoid confrontation with this dirty reality, becoming the Raven, a ghost of a man, living by his own unwritten code. He despised his weakness, his inability to fight the system without breaking the law. Marat, his idealistic friend and colleague, proved to be stronger. He did not run away. He stayed and continued the fight, but chose the darkest and most irreversible path. Murder was not the end for him, but the beginning of his personal, fanatical judgment. Are you for the criminal code that is for sale, or for order that must be restored at any cost? Marat's words cut through the air like shards of ice. The Raven lowered his eyes to the shadow. The dog, who was usually calm, now whimpered restlessly. The sound was almost inaudible in the roar of the waterfall, but to Ivan, it was deafening. Shadow sensed not danger, but his master's internal deadly conflict. His whimpering was a plea, a demand. Make the right choice, but make it now. The dog, the living embodiment of the natural code, was interfering in human drama for the first time ever, as if sensing that this choice would change both of them, their lives, their unspoken law. Ivan remembered his last conversation with Marat before his dismissal. Marat had said then that the system was a monster that fed on our honesty, and we, the law enforcement officers, were just food to be digested. He shouted that we had to be ready for surgical intervention, that simple therapy would not cure it. At the time, Ivan called him a fanatic. Now he stood before him, unable to call him a murderer. Because Marat's motive was pure. He did not kill out of greed. He killed for a higher order, for the taiga, which he considered a living being. Murder is always a defeat, Voron repeated, but not for Marat, but for himself, trying to hold on to the elusive principle. But then he looked at the gold bars lying next to the flash drive. This gold, obtained illegally through bribery and violence, had become a symbol of crime. And the flash drive was the key to exposure, to justice, which the criminal code had already buried. Ivan slowly knelt down, keeping his eyes on Marat, and reached for the flash drive. This movement was his final decision. He had made up his mind. He would not follow the letter of a corrupt law that would cover up corporate crimes. He would follow his own internal code, the TAIGA code, which demanded that balance be restored. He knew that Marat had paid the price for committing murder. Now it was time for him to pay. I won't arrest you, Marat. Raven's voice sounded hoarse but firm. But I don't condone your methods. You crossed the line that separates a man from an avenger. You took the right to judge, and that is your eternal burden. Voron picked up the flash drive and the gold. He felt the weight of the bars in his hand. Not just physical, but moral. This was his new prize, his new weapon, and his new responsibility. He understood that he was not just letting the criminal go. He was entering into a tacit agreement with him, becoming an accomplice in restoring the higher order. He had broken the law to restore the natural balance. Marat, seeing Ivan take the flash drive, relaxed. For the first time during their entire conversation, the fanatical fire in his eyes faded, giving way to a quiet, deep sadness that Voron knew from his own experience. It was the sadness of a man who realized that his pure motive had been stained with blood. But he had found no other way for himself. "Thank you, Ivan. Now it's your burden," Marat said quietly, getting up. 3 hours, Marat.
3 hours to disappear forever. If I see you, I'll do what I have to do, said Raven, his hand on the carbine he had left in the forest, not wavering. Marat nodded, as if he had accepted the sentence.
He picked up his knife, fastened it to his belt, took the geoanalyzer, and, without looking back, headed for the path leading from the waterfall into the wilderness. He was not leaving as a fugitive, but as an executor who had completed his mission, handing over the last weapon to someone he trusted. Ivan watched him until Marat's figure disappeared into the mist rising from the roaring waterfall.
He was left alone, with gold in his hands, and a flash drive that could blow up the entire region. He had made his choice, and he knew that this choice, between the TAIGA code and the criminal code, had already changed him forever.
The roar of the black waterfall gradually subsided behind Ivan, becoming only a distant, monotonous echo. He walked back, not along the road he had come, but along the most difficult, untrodden path, to avoid an accidental encounter with Marat, and give him the promised 3 hours.
Voron held a flash drive in his hand, burning his palm with its intangible but explosive truth, and in his backpack, wrapped in old thick cloth, lay the confiscated gold.
It was heavy, and this weight, both physical and moral, was the price of his choice. Ivan let the killer go, to save not just the forest, but the idea of justice, which, in his opinion, the law had long since betrayed.
The way back took longer than he had expected. When he finally reached the road leading to the village, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in colors full of quiet sadness. Ivan felt neither triumph nor relief,
Only cold, devastating fatigue and a sense of irrevocability.
He had crossed the line forever, becoming an accomplice. But at the same time he knew that he had acted according to his inner, incorruptible code. He called Fomin from a long-abandoned, barely working payphone on the edge of the village. The captain rushed over in 20 minutes, his face pale and tense. Apparently, Prokhorov had already managed to cause him a lot of trouble, demanding a final report on the domestic incident. "Ivan, where have you been?" "Prokhorov is already writing a report on failure to comply with orders, and I was almost fired myself. What's going on? Did you find anything?" Fomin could barely control the tremor in his voice.
Voron silently placed a backpack in front of him and took out some ingots. Gold. The ingots glimmered dimly in the last rays of the sun. Here, a gold vein. The miners managed to find a large batch and hid it.
"Our stash." Ivan's voice was official, cold. He didn't lie, but he didn't tell the whole truth either. "I found their hideout, about 10 kilometers from the winter camp, near the old dam. They died in a fight over this gold, just as Prokhorov had predicted. A common story."
Fomin stared at the gold, his eyes widening with shock and greed, mixed with relief. This was his salvation, his career springboard.
He immediately forgot his doubts and the strange massacre he had witnessed. The bars spoke louder than any evidence or philosophical code. "Excellent. This is incredible,"
I knew it was just greed. Prokhorov will be furious.
The captain began feverishly grabbing the bars, as if afraid they would disappear. Not just gold, Voron continued, handing him a flash drive. Here, documentation. Found it in the same cache as the gold. I'd call it the result of our joint operation. The flash drive contains complete geological surveys, and even some audio recordings. This proves that the prospectors were working for a large Moscow company. It's called SibGeoInvest. They were conducting illegal exploration. You can make a career out of this, Fomin. Start an investigation into economic crime, money laundering, and illegal mining. It will raise you above anyone, even Prokhorov. Voron spoke quickly, clearly, and convincingly, carefully creating a legend that completely excluded any traces of Marat. No marks on the stone, no traps, no traces of the geoanalyzer. He attributed the discovery of the gold and flash drives to himself in the cache that they allegedly searched for together. It was a lie, but a lie for salvation. He was giving Fomin a chance that he himself had once lost. A chance to fight corruption using the law, not a knife. Fomin, completely blinded by sudden success and the opportunity to defeat Prokhorov, no longer had any doubts. He saw the gold. He saw the flash drive. He saw the path to success. Your name will be in the report, Ivan. Your help. My name won't be in any reports, Captain. Voron interrupted him, his gaze turning icy. I didn't see anything and I don't know anything. You found it yourself as a result of your operational work. If you mention my name, I'll tell everyone how you brought a dog to the crime scene, how you ignored the investigator's instructions, and how you tried to close a case that was supposed to be a sensation. I came back to TAIGA to get away from your filth, Fomin, and I don't want to go back. Ivan turned away. He knew that the city law would most likely not affect high-ranking officials right away, and SibGeoInvest's lawyers would fight to the end. But the balance had been restored. Greed had been punished with death. The gold had been confiscated. And most importantly, the truth, encrypted on a flash drive, had been handed over to a man who still had faith in the system and ambition. It was the only way to fight the monster without becoming one himself. The shadow, as if having fulfilled his mission, calmly followed his master. The raven did not look back. He left Fomin, who was frantically making calls on his cell phone, holding the ingots in one hand and the flash drive in the other. He left him to deal with the city problems, with the corruption and power that come with big gold. Ivan walked to his house, where silence, the warmth of the stove, and the unwritten code of the taiga awaited him. He knew that this choice, to let the killer go for the sake of a higher, albeit bloody, truth, would forever remain his secret and his eternal burden. He walked a few hundred meters and stopped. A shadow poked his nose into his hand. The investigator declared the case closed, and that night I dreamed of a silent witness, whispered the raven. But the silent witness, the taiga, was now silent, because justice had been restored. The price of returning to his former life was too high, but the price of maintaining balance had been paid. He walked away, leaving only footprints on the wet autumn ground behind him.